I'm W.T. Edmondson, and welcome to Focus. Freedom often causes unbelievable silence. Well, you can see I'm very casual today. I walked away and left my coat, so we're going to be very casual today. We have with us Reverend Beau Underwood, and he is the pastor of First Christian Church, Disciples of Christ here in Jefferson City. And being relatively new to the community, I wanted to sit down and have a conversation with him, basically about where he is and some of the things that he's done and where he sees Jefferson City being in his short stay here. So we're going to have a brief conversation. It's going to be fast-paced because we want to get as much information as we possibly can from him today. Reverend Underwood, welcome to Focus.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay. Give us a brief verbal bio on Beau Underwood. Who is Beau Underwood?
Absolutely. Well, I was born and raised in a very small town a couple hours west of Chicago in Illinois. Born and raised, grew up there my whole life. Went to college in Illinois, went to grad school in Illinois, got mixed up in politics a little bit, and worked on a couple campaigns in Illinois, and then moved out to Washington, D.C. to do faith-based advocacy work. While I was there, I also started working in a congregation part-time and really enjoyed congregational ministry more than I ever thought I would, and started thinking about what that meant for my life and where God might be calling me. And it seemed like it was into the congregation because I think this ministry that happens in churches is so vital and so important. And heard about an opening here in Jefferson City, made some contacts, and it seemed like a good fit, and the Spirit seemed to be moving, and here we are.
Married?
Got a wonderful wife named Casey. She works up at the University of Missouri. Both of us are just excited to be a part of this community.
Being relatively new to Jefferson City, what is your assessment of Jefferson City thus far?
Well, one of the things that really attracted us here, I grew up in a much smaller town of a few thousand people and have lived in bigger cities. My wife grew up in a more suburban setting and also has lived in larger urban areas. And Jefferson City seemed to have a nice balance. It's not too big that you can't know who your neighbors are, get to know the community, get involved in it, but it's big enough that there's some things happening here. And especially when you lump it in with the larger Columbia area, there's a lot going on. So I think, especially being the state capital, there's some real levers of power here in the city that impact what's going on across the whole state. And so it's exciting to be in a town of this size that is still sort of where the action is, so to speak, and the chance to really make a difference in the lives of a lot of people, more so than just the few tens of thousands of us gathered here in Jeff.
Describe the type of clergy that you set out to be, and how do you think your congregation see you?
Absolutely. It's a great question. I'm learning over and over again how challenging and yet rewarding congregational ministry can be. You're asked to be a teacher, you're asked to be a chaplain, you're asked to be a therapist, you're asked to be a grief counselor, you're also asked to be administrator. I mean, there's all these different hats that clergy wear, and can be very, very challenging because none of us are going to be exceptional at all of those hats, yet we have to wear them all. I also think that there's this divide in the church between more progressive-minded folks who want to have clergy out there leading at the forefront of advocacy and social justice, and the more conservative-minded folks who often just want a prayer partner, somebody to help them walk closer with Jesus. And I don't think that dichotomy should exist. I think in reality, our faith has a public element to it that has to be lived out, but that public element has to be deeply rooted in our spirituality. We simply can't keep our faith private, but we can't divorce who we are outside of the church from who we are inside the church. So I've spent my career thus far, and certainly want to spend my ministry here, at that intersection of private faith and public witness, believing that the two simply can't be separated the way the church often tries to.
And you touched on my next question, which was, what is Disciple of Christ's position on social justice and community advocacy?
Absolutely. We have a great denomination. It was formed out of a split with the Presbyterian Church a couple hundred years ago over questions about who should be at the communion table. And It's always been a denomination that has privileged freedom of conscience, the idea that we read Scripture in community, but yet we form our own conclusions about it, and a denomination that really values a congregational governance. So we have a great diversity amongst our congregations. Theologically and politically conservative churches, theologically and politically progressive churches, and everybody in between. It's what makes the church so amazing is that unity amidst the diversity. I think being in a state capital, there's some interesting dynamics to ministry that happen here, right? You've got people working in government all day long who are then worshiping in your pews on Sunday morning. We're sitting here in a town with a maximum security prison, and the legislators who decide our state's criminal justice policies. It's a fascinating place to do ministry, and really I'm excited that my church has a long history of being one of those churches that has tried to have a role in the city for the betterment of the community, and I'm excited to get a chance to pastor a lot of people who think that way, about the fact that the church doesn't exist just for ourselves, but for the whole community.
Well, one person that thinks that way that you I'm sure privileged to pastor, and that's Reverend John Bennett.
Absolutely.
A longtime friend of mine, and who has been a social justice fighter for years. Coming from your personal perspective, as you indicated, there is this divide within any congregation as to ideology and how they feel things should go. Personally, where do you stand?
My old boss at Sojourners, a guy named Jim Wallace, used to say that faith is always personal but never private. And I think that what we are called to be is a community that lives out its faith in the public square. John Bennett's a great example of that, a man of deep faith and deep conviction. And he's showed that how those convictions matter in public life. It's really challenging, I think, when we personalize faith and say it's just all about just me and Jesus, because that's such a limitation. When you read the gospel, Jesus is constantly challenging the powers that be. He's constantly calling people to a better way of life that often is a confrontation of the social powers and social norms of his day, not just for the sake of being a rebel, but because our sinfulness, our brokenness inherently limits who we are. And we're called as Christians to overcome that. That's, our faith teaches us that there's more to this life than often what's present before us. I love the phrase of, I came that they might have life more abundantly. Mm-hmm. Abundant life is what we're after. Mm-hmm. I think that, unfortunately, the church has not often seen that as its role. We get scared when we start having these conversations about issues that are polarizing or issues that are controversial. Thankfully, my tradition, the disciples, we've long said we don't always all have to agree, but we're always going to trust each other with the conversation. So I want to have a church that really is a place where people can have those conversations and then figure out where they go from those conversations in terms of public witness. Mm-hmm.
You spoke of Sojourner. For those who don't know what Sojourner is, tell us about it.
Sojourners is a national Christian advocacy organization. They publish a magazine, they do public witness in DC, and they do work with churches around the country. It was founded in the 1970s in response to, from when some evangelicals got together and said we need to be a little more thoughtful about our foreign policy practices in regards to the Vietnam War, and also the fact that we have so many Americans living in poverty and we don't seem to be doing a whole lot about that as a society. Out of that has grown this incredible witness that has really sought to be prophetic and to be deeply faithful and not buy into the sort of politics that says you're either this or you're this, when in reality the hat we're called to wear is a lot more complex than that in terms of our Christian faith. I got a chance to work closely with the founder and President Jim Wallace to do some of our issue advocacy on Capitol Hill and in DC, and also work with our coalition partners on a range of issues from immigration reform issues to poverty issues, to really making sure that we're fostering an understanding and promotion of peace so that violence is a last resort and not a first resort.
As we talk about social justice, with issues such as immorality, discrimination, equal access, equal opportunity, equal protection under the law, and etc., broadly speaking, how effective do you feel the faith community has been in speaking out publicly on these issues and other issues that adversely impact the community?
This is a really good question, and I'm going to say something that might get me in a little bit of trouble. I think we've always been good at speaking out. I'm not sure we've always been as good as doing what we say. Sometimes I feel like we've said something and we say, okay, that's enough. We've done our part. And of course, I'm a big believer that if you don't back up your words with actions, then you haven't really done a whole lot. So my main concern for the church is less about what it says, though I obviously want people saying the right things. But what are we doing? How are we making a difference? How are we truly seeking after justice? How are we truly offering mercy to those who need it? How are we witnessing to the love of God in ways that is good news to the whole community? I think we talk a good game, but sometimes I'm not sure we walk it as well as we need to. And I don't think that's true. I think that's true about the whole church universal, not just one congregation or one city or one aspect of Christianity. I think there's just a lot of places where congregations haven't seen living out their faith as core to who they are, and they tend to isolate Monday through Saturday from what they do on Sunday mornings. And that really bothers me. As a pastor, I want people to integrate what they believe about Sunday morning, what they hear preached, what they sing in their songs, what they pray in their prayers, to how they live the whole rest of their life. Following Jesus is a path of discipleship. It's a path of following. It's not a path of just sitting in a pew on Sunday morning.
As listening to you there, in essence, what you're basically saying is that as we have conversations or we speak to an issue, but if we don't put those words into action, then we're basically condoning what is going on.
Absolutely. And I would go even one step farther. When we don't have lenses, have glasses, have ways of seeing the world that are rooted in our faith, we miss a chance to witness the gospel. Let me give you a quick example. I really struggle with, there's probably a sermon in me here on how we as a society don't seem to believe in redemption, which is challenging for me because it's a major part of the Christian story. Christians would say that redemption is critical to the whole narrative of who Jesus was and is for us back then and today. But if you look at, for example, some of the ways that we deal with reentry issues of people coming out of prison, there's not a lot of redemption there. The whole point, in theory, has been you commit a wrong against society, you go away to prison, and I know there's some issues in how that all works, and I not just dismissing those, but I'm talking about the other side of it. You pay your debt. We always say you pay your debt, and you come out. Well, if your debt's paid off, you should have a clean slate. But so many people can't get jobs. They go fill out an application for a job, they pay their debt to society, and it says, have you ever been a felon? Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Check yes or no. They check yes. And the employer throws their application away. What does that say about redemption? Do we not believe that people can be redeemed? The Christian story says absolutely. That's what Jesus does for us, and that's what we're called to be. And yet our society doesn't live that out at all. So why is the church not challenging that? Why is the church not saying to society, redemption is possible. We see it every day. It's who we are. So why is our society not doing a better job of offering people the chance to be redeemed? It's really, I think, a failure of thinking about the world in a Christian way.
Yeah. And having a conversation one-on-one, they would say, the Lord redeemed me.
Right. But it's more than that. It's a societal element to it. Jesus absolutely, I think, has a very personal relationship in Scripture with each of his disciples, and we know that through the Spirit he has a personal relationship with each of us. But he wasn't just talking to people one-on-one. He was talking to groups of people. He was talking about the structures of society as a whole. It's not an either-or. It's a both-and. It's about personal redemption and communal redemption.
Thinking about where we are in this country, many conservatives appear to think that 50 years or more of affirmative action, equal opportunity, equal access are enough, and that we are now in a colorblind society. And on the other hand, many liberals seem to have become reluctant to speak forcefully out on issues that they once spoke very forcefully on and championing. So looking at where the pendulum is now, where do you see it needs to go?
I lament every day that I think our politics has become so broken. It's easy to just turn on the news, to watch what's going on in the presidential race, to realize that this is sometimes a race to the bottom. And unfortunately, we don't really There's this phrase in the Constitution about promoting the general welfare of society as what government's supposed to be about. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of people involved in our politics that aren't really concerned about the general welfare. They're concerned about their personal welfare. And I think that leads to some really bad politics and some really bad policy. And unfortunately, we have media that exacerbates this brokenness, this divide between right and left and liberal and conservative, and it puts people in these boxes. And those boxes are just as fallen, those boxes are just as finite, those boxes are just as broken as any other element of human society. To quote Paul, we've all fallen short of the glory of God, whether we're liberal or conservative. But what I think that it does is it makes it impossible for us to get beyond those boxes to seek after solutions to the real challenges that we face, because our challenges are very, very, very real. There's a bedrock principle of American society from the day we were founded as a nation. We haven't always lived up to it, but we've always seemed to be sort of striving towards realizing it more and more. Equality of opportunity. At the end of the day, the question should be, do we live in a society where everybody has an equal shot? Does everybody get a chance to achieve the American dream? And we've seen laws passed throughout our history that have expanded that opportunity, and we celebrate them. Some of them have come under fire more lately because there's this debate about how much we've actually accomplished. And I think there we have to get past the talking points, and we have to look at the data. What are our graduation rates? What are our income rates? Are we actually realizing opportunity where everybody's getting that fair shot? If not, how do we fix it? How do we help realize it? How do we live into those ideals? If we are, where are the places that we can celebrate and move past? But maybe because we've gotten far, we need to keep those things where they are because they've helped us get there. But unfortunately, the whole idea that everybody deserves an equal shot seems to be under question right now. And I just think that makes us a whole lot worse off as a society. And again, as a pastor, as somebody seeing this through a Christian lens, what I'm really concerned about is human flourishing. God created us for abundant life. I want us to be in a society where everybody has an equal shot at enjoying an abundant life, whatever that means for them.
Going local,
Please.
each year there has been allegations of disparate treatment in the public schools. As you're thinking about the causes of these disparate treatments, parents say, my kid is being suspended, and looking at the numbers, it appears that black kids are being suspended more quicker, longer than white kids, which has become a very, very serious issue in Jefferson City and probably other places as well. How does the faith community shine a light on disparate treatment, whether it's in schools, public government, whatever?
Absolutely. I know the schools issue, especially in Jeff City, can be one of the most hot button topics, and I'm still really learning the landscape. We are at First Christian are able to have an incredible relationship with East School, and we've done some mentoring with the kids there and other ways of supporting the school so that the teachers and the administration in that school can help those kids flourish in as many ways as possible. We've been reading as a church this new book by Robert Putnam called Our Kids, which talks about the state of kids in our society and how, frankly, they're not having the same opportunities that they once had, and that's something we should be really concerned about because of what it portends for the future. I think the question you're asking is especially important because it gets into some of these biases that we may not always be aware of, and that we need to take a hard look at and ask ourselves these questions of if these are how the statistics are showing, if these are the people being affected and they're not bearing out along the lines you would expect, why is that happening? I think oftentimes churches are called to ask the moral questions. Is this right or is this wrong? And if it's wrong, what can we do about it? We're not necessarily called to say, here's the exact policy, here's the fix. I know a lot of really morally well-intentioned people on both sides of the aisle. And frankly, I met a few people out in D.C. who weren't morally well-intentioned on both sides of the aisle. It's amazing, right? But at the same time, I don't think that the church should stand down and asking questions and saying, what's going on here? Is this really how we want this to be? Why is this happening? And shouldn't something be done about it? And then when ideas are proposed, looking at what they're going to do, looking at the outcomes they're going to create, and offering a critique, and sometimes even offering an affirmation. We shouldn't be afraid to say, this would be a good thing. Mm-hmm. But we should realize that at the end of the day, any public policy we create is going to always fall short of our ideals because we're finite, broken creatures.
Yeah. Well, East School as you indicated, is a very hot issue yeah, right now in Jefferson City. One is because of the age, basically, of e-school, space, and so forth. But the other thing that cannot be discounted is a large percentage of students that go to e-school are relatively poor and African American. And so when you look at where the public school system is and what needs to be done, I think the public school system has become somewhat timid of being pushed to build a new school at East, but the public school system hasn't been very successful in their bond issues to get new schools built lately. And so how do you see the faith community playing a role in elevating the conversation as to the condition of people who are currently in low-income status, and they deserve the best as any other student?
I think it all comes back to this book we've been reading, Our Kids. They're not your kids, they're not my kids, they're our kids. I think that faith community has to constantly keep that reminder in front of the broader community. At the end of the day, our society is only as strong as the next generation. And if we're failing our kids through our schools, through any other sort of aspect of society, that's going to hurt us all down the road. There's a collective responsibility we have to help the next generation get ready to succeed in life. And if we have failing schools, if we have one segment of the community that's failing in our schools, that's going to hurt us all. And so it's not just, oh, those kids over there aren't our problem because our kids over here are fine. No, 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 no. All of these kids are our kids. We all have a stake in their future. And we should make sure that we're all living up to that obligation and making sure that those kids are going to have a fair shot at life. I mean, again, it's this equality of opportunity that has been a bedrock principle of our society that we don't seem to always take as seriously as we should. We give it lip service, but do we really often think as much as we should about what it really means? I want every kid to have a shot at being the next Steve Jobs, to have a shot at being the next great faith leader, to have a shot at being the next great politician, because human capital is the most important thing we have as a society. It's what has helped build this country, and it's what has helped build this particular community, is the great leadership, the great ideas, the great contributions of some great people.
During difficult economic times, the poor and people of color are often looked upon as being the scourge of that community for whatever reason it may be. Again, what role can the faith community play in shining a light on the impact of poverty and the impact of injustice to the minority population in any community?
I think there's this phrase that gets tossed around by policymakers of the racial wealth gap, the disparities in wealth between white families and non-white families. And especially in poor economic times, that becomes especially critical because there's just oftentimes not as much to fall back on for people of color in our society. And we don't realize that safety net is much stronger for those who have something in the bank than those who don't. And then, of course, you put on top of that, when we fall into tough economic times, that it's harder to find a job, it's harder to make ends meet. Everybody feels like they're struggling for a smaller slice of the same pie. And what I would really want to do is that race, that sense that we're all after the same thing and we have to get ahead, otherwise we're going to lose and somebody else is going to win, is not what it means to live together well. Democracy, right? This whole idea of this democratic experiment is how do we live well together? We're all in this together. And what I would say is we need to really be talking about, instead of being an isolated society of individuals, how we are a collective society where every person counts, every voice matters, and we have a stake in how everybody's doing. In the short term, there are charity, there's ways of helping people that need it in a critical moment, but in the long term, there's justice questions of how do we structure society in a way that, again, everybody has this fair chance and everybody has the resources they need to flourish as God intends. There's no right way or wrong way to get there. There are many different ways to get there, but I hope we can all share that same goal of everybody having the same shot and the same chance at flourishing.
What do you think that has led to such divisiveness, especially in the political arena. What has brought us to this point where, I mean, you know, Republican Democrat is always, they've always had their issues and that they stand on, and they battle to, you know, on those issues. But there were a time when they would come together on major issues that impacted the country as a whole. But now it seems as though they are so divisive and so separated that it appears that nothing gets done.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, sadly, the incentives in the whole system are wrong. People are only going to do what they're incentivized to do. They're going to always, sadly, look out for their self-interest, and they're going to protect themselves. And we've created, in a lot of, both at the federal level and sometimes even at the state level, places where these districts are drawn in such a way that, as a politician, your biggest concern is not about winning the general election, but winning the primary. And your biggest threat is a primary challenger from the extreme end of your party who thinks that you're not ideologically pure enough. And that creates this sense of, I can't compromise. I can't work with the other side of the aisle to get something done to solve the problem. I need to show how tough I've been, how much I've stood up and fought for my principles. And there's nothing wrong with having principles, but there's also nothing wrong with compromising for the common good. It used to be that we cared about society as a whole. Again, we promoted the general welfare. But now what we're really interested in is self-preservation, is keeping myself in my seat for as long as possible and doing whatever it takes to make sure I'm not going to get booted. And if that biggest risk of getting booted is in the primary, then what I have to do is be as ideologically pure. And so you have fairly liberal districts where people are ideologically pure. You have fairly conservative districts where people are ideologically pure. And that middle ground where everybody used to meet and compromise and find workable solutions, this spirit of pragmatism that has long driven our political system seems to have fallen completely by the wayside. And my hope is that it's a fad. My hope is we'll somehow figure out how to get beyond this, because you worry about how much longer we can tolerate as a country the dysfunction that comes from a lack of concern for the common good.
And I guess coming from the Washington, D.C. area, you saw a lot of that.
You do. You see a whole lot of it, and it's amazing. I hope I'm not surprising anybody by saying this, but it surprised me at times. When I would be up on the Hill in a member's office, Republican or Democrat, a lot of them would say, and I hate to say this, but it's true, we know you're right. We wish we could do that, but the politics are just terrible on this. And we have a system right now where the incentives are all set up so that people can't do the right thing even though they know what it is. And it's just stunning. Again, back to this moral critique. It's morally terrible that you have people who know what the right thing is and they aren't willing to do it because they're so worried about losing an election. And you would think that everybody who participates in that system would want to fix it so that everybody can have the incentive to do the right thing. I remember a senator once telling me, to my face, just him, Senator and I, talking, and he said, I had this legislation on the floor. It was fairly controversial, but everybody knew it would solve a problem. And he came up, he had someone from the other side of the aisle come up to him and say, I couldn't vote with you. I just couldn't do it. The politics at home were too bad, but I'm praying that you win. And I looked at him. He was just stunned by this. And I looked at him, I said, Senator, you should have said to him, sometimes God calls us to be the answer to our own prayers. Because it was just shocking to me that he would literally say, I'm praying, I'm hoping to God that this passes, but I can't vote for it because of the politics. How broken is that?
Yeah. Coming to a close here, what is the role, as you see it, of faith leaders outside the four walls of their church, temple, or synagogue?
I think that there's always this question. It's a theoretical question that we talk about in books or we read about in books and talk about among each other, and then there's this practical question of how it lives out in public. Who's your congregation? Is your congregation your membership, the people who sit in your pews, who put money in your offering plate, who make your church go? Is that the people you're called to care for? Or is there a larger audience that you're speaking to as a faith leader? And I think the answer is both. I have to be the pastor to my church. Those are the people who have called me to be their minister. They're the ones who said, you're our pastor. And they're the people who God has given me to love and shepherd and care for. At the same time, we're one church in a much larger community. And how this community is doing, what's happening in this community matters tremendously to us. We're trying to serve it through meeting needs, but we're also trying to help it and be a witness to this hope that we've found in what God has done for the world. And part of when I see my role as a public witness is witnessing to that hope and saying there's a better way to be. We as a society, there's an ideals that we're striving for that we aren't living up to. And the challenge is not to be the hypocrite. Is when people see the church failing down or the synagogue failing down or any other faith community failing down, they say, why would we listen to you? Why would we take your advice? Why would we listen to your analysis, your critique, when you can't even live up to it yourself? So I think a major key in doing a good public witness is sort of having your own ducks in line so that people look at what you're doing and they say, okay, he's got some credibility here because his church is living up to their ideals.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it a lot. Thanks for having me.
Okay. I've been speaking with Reverend Beau Underwood, and he is the pastor of First Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. We will have other conversations as we are speaking with various ministers in the community, and we will continue this conversation because if the faith community fails, the community fails. We'll see you next time. God bless.